Welcome to Mondays at Mount Olive for April 15th, 2025. Happy Tuesday. Yes, I'm Pastor Dan Torkelson, Senior Pastor at Mount Olive Lutheran Church in Madison, Wisconsin. And yes, it's a Tuesday. It's Tuesday of Holy Week, and let's just say it was a long weekend with confirmation and our last family confirmation to boot. So with a big weekend coming up and coming off a very long weekend this past weekend and thinking a little bit about last year and where I wound up during Holy Week, I tried to take a bit of a breather yesterday. I'm taking it, pacing myself quite a bit here this week just to make sure that all's good when we get to Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And I have services all of those days this year. I also did have some trouble kind of putting this one together. Holy Week is an embarrassment of riches for this week's podcast, and so there was a little bit of difficulty trying to focus all this. Hopefully we can cover this in a clean and focused way. I thought, why don't I just talk a little bit about Holy Week and kind of what's all involved there. Holy Week, of course, is an entire week. It's a Sunday to a Saturday, beginning with Palm Sunday in the gospel texts and really sort of running out everything that happens with Jesus all the way through his burial, which is where he is all day on Saturday, obviously, as you know, except his descent into hell apparently takes place probably on Holy Saturday, where he goes down and proclaims his victory, which, hint, hint, this is the whole secret to the Easter Vigil, which I'll talk about in a minute. The victory's already won, even though Jesus isn't raised yet. Maybe we get to talk about that just in a couple of minutes here. But let's talk about Holy Week, at least the first part of it, Palm Sunday through Wednesday of the week. Palm Sunday is a very, very dramatic day. Jesus enters into Jerusalem riding a donkey, and here he is fulfilling prophecy in Zechariah, in the book of Zechariah, chapter 12. Behold, see, your king comes to you, humble and riding a donkey. He comes in as the king, but it's certainly not on a majestic steed or, dressed like a warrior. And the people come out and very humbly greet him too, using palm branches and strewing their garments on the road and saying things like Hosanna in the highest, which means come down now from highest heaven. And blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It seems that the crowd seems pretty convinced he's the Messiah. There may be some, I'd say, incorrect thoughts about who he is in the sense that he's the king who's going to depose Rome. But that's not what that's not what he looks like when he's on the donkey and riding in looking like Jesus. He doesn't look like that kind of king. And he's not. He's coming to bring his kingdom, which is a kingdom that he would tell Pilate later in the week is not of this world. Once he gets off the donkey, he makes a beeline for the temple. And in the temple, he overcharges the money changers' tables. The temple had become a market. People would come from all over the place, including other nations. And if they wanted to make a sacrifice at the temple, they couldn't just always bring their cattle from wherever they were coming from, so they could buy it there. It was a marketplace. And this was out of line for what God's intention for his holy house was, and Jesus lets them know in a righteous rage and sets the table. This is the central theme of this week, going through Thursday, I would say. The theme really is the temple is not yours, it's my Father's, and your nation and your religion is not yours, it belongs to me. And this is an intense teaching. This is a very focused and intense teaching. We talked about this a little bit last week because it's during this time that you see Jesus tell like the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where the workers think they run the vineyard, but the vineyard is actually still owned by God, and they put the son to death and all of that. But there's a lot of intensity in the teaching during this time. The religious types, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're coming along and testing him during this time. And some really great sayings of Jesus come out of these tests, especially in the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, you get that wonderful story of Jesus being asked about the tax. Do we pay taxes or not? And he asks for the coin. So show me the coin. Whose inscription's on the coin? Well, Caesar's inscription was on the coin. And then he says this brilliant, and I mean, this is its own Mondays at Mount Olive someday, a brilliant answer. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's, which ties everybody's hands. They would love to get him saying don't pay taxes. Then they can get Rome to do the dirty work for them. They can go to Rome and go to Pilate and say, hey, he's like defying you guys. but he doesn't. And at the same time, he says, render unto God the things that are God's. And you got to imagine the Pharisees are smart enough, at least with regard to the Old Testament scriptures, to be hearing Psalm 24, verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, which in a way implies that Caesar has nothing. Not that he can't collect taxes, but that he really has nothing. But he doesn't say either one. He gives such a brilliant answer that it's like handcuffing the Pharisees. It's just this is one of many. There are questions about marriage or questions about a number of things. They're trying to get him to commit some sort of heresy, and he doesn't fall for it. Sometimes he says, like they ask him, by what authority do you do these things? And he says, with regard to David, where did he get his authority? And they don't want to answer that. And he said, well, if you're not going to answer my question, I'm not going to answer yours. Nah. So there's all sorts of wonderful little sparring going on in these days. And that kind of builds up to a very intense moment, which I believe happens on Wednesday. It's kind of hard to get the timing of these days down when you're reading the text. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus proclaims 7 woes on the Pharisees. And this is hard stuff. A professor of mine, I remember him saying, Jesus gives the Pharisees both barrels, and he calls them whitewashed tombs, sons of hell. He's calling them names. He's so mad at them. And again, this is a righteous anger. And I'm sure the Pharisees had every reason to want to get rid of him after they heard all that. In Matthew 24 and 25, he goes eschatological. He starts talking about the end times. This is the sheep and the goats section. This is where he's talking about the sun going dark and all these sorts of things. Where he very famously says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And that's a very emphatic statement when he says it. And of course, as all of this teaching is going on in this very narrow focused, ain't your temple, it's my Father's temple, ain't your church, it's my church message, the plans for his arrest are intensifying, and I think they're already coming to the conclusion, we got to get this done. We got to get it done by Passover. By Passover Sabbath, Saturday, this has to be over. One way or the other is the way his enemies are thinking. Well, of course, the week then continues into Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. The technical term for these 3 days is called the Triduum. The 3 days, that's what it literally means, Triduum. They are the 3 holy days. Maundy Thursday, the word Maundy, I get asked this question a lot, comes from the Latin term mandatum, or mandate, command, and it is a reference to Jesus' new command, which he gave in the upper room in John chapter 13, love one another as I have loved you. That's where that term comes from. It is the day of the mandate. That day basically moves from Jesus's preparations, very detailed too, by the way, preparations for the meal that evening in the upper room, which then bleeds out to Gethsemane, where he prays, and of course the disciples can't stay awake, and there's that whole story, and then ultimately to his arrest, his betrayal at the hands of Judas Iscariot, and his arrest. Those we sort of all attribute to Thursday, although it's getting later and later and later in the day. And Good Friday, of course, that's the day of his trials, his encounter with Pilate, and all of his suffering, pre-crucifixion and while on the cross. Don't need to explain a lot of that, although what you're going to find on Good Friday at our services, we're going to dig deep into that one word. It's one word in the Greek, tetelestai, which means it is finished. And I hope you enjoy that, because it's going to be I think it's going to be a profound day. It usually always is. Saturday, Holy Saturday, is of course his day of rest in the tomb, but it is also the day of the weekly day of rest for Israel, and it happens to be the highest and holiest of those days of rest of the year, because it is the Passover Sabbath where Jesus rests in the tomb. You heard me say a few weeks ago, a couple of you commented to me, you were a little surprised when I said this, that in a sense we can't go to dark Gethsemane, in a sense we can't come to Calvary's holy mountain. What matters with regard to the gospel of good news is that Jesus brings Calvary's holy mountain to us in the word and in the sacraments. But what we do try to do in Holy Week is we try to let the texts of the Bible take us there. That's the whole point of the services. Being at the service on Monday, Thursday takes us to the upper room, takes us to, and maybe inevitably to the garden. We talk more about that in the Passion reading on Friday, but that's all part of Thursday. And if you're in your own private readings as well, it's a great time to just go there through the Bible text. That's what the text is there for. On Good Friday, we go to Calvary's Holy Mountain. We come to Calvary's Holy Mountain and see through the text, through the eyes of the text, our salvation being won by Jesus. And on Holy Saturday, we wait. We wait, and we wait expectantly for the ending of the story that we already know is going to happen. And that's the beauty of the Christian faith. The Christian faith has that hope in a resurrection. Jesus did rise from the dead on Easter Sunday, and that hope then correlates to our resurrection on the last day as well. And that is the whole point of a term I think that's kind of new to us here at Mount Olive, because we are working with our sister congregation, the Student Center at Calvary, for a service called the Easter Vigil. This is an ancient service. This goes back a long, long ways. And when we talk about the Easter Vigil, what we're talking about is we are talking about a service of waiting. We are, in a sense, keeping a vigil. But if you've ever kept a vigil at a deathbed, and I have many times in my own family, but also as a pastor, many times, and it's always been a privilege. I got to say that too. You know, when I've had 3 different times in my ministry, I've had someone die with my hand on their head while we were praying the Lord's Prayer. I cannot tell you what a privilege that is. It's as much a privilege as being there when someone is born as I was for my children. It is just an amazing, amazing moment. But we're not keeping the vigil quite the same way on Holy Saturday. We're keeping a vigil because we're not watching for someone to die. He's already dead. We're watching for someone to rise from the dead. So this is not hopeless. The vigils of this life, when a person is on their deathbed, they have a feeling of a certain kind of hopelessness. Not the Easter Vigil. The Easter Vigil is a service where we use our baptisms. We use a number of lengthier readings from the Old Testament stories like the creation, the flood, Israel's deliverance at the original Passover, even like the 3 men in the fiery furnace is one of the standard texts for Easter Vigil. All of these texts, all of these stories rehearse for us again the story of salvation. These are for one night we live like Old Testament believers, I guess is the way that the Easter Vigil works. We live in anticipation of a salvation we know is going to happen. They were saved the same way we are. They were saved by believing in a Jesus who had not come yet. We have the benefit of hindsight, and that benefit really does aid us at the Easter Vigil as we spend our time rehearsing those stories, rejoicing in the water of our baptism, receiving his body and blood in the Easter Vigil as part of the service. All of this is part of our watching. It's part of our being prepared for the victory cry that's going to go out on Easter Sunday. And I'm not going to say any more about Easter Sunday because that's next week's Monday. Monday's at Mount Olive. But that's Holy Week for you. And for us this year, it's going to end with an Easter Vigil. An Easter Vigil service at Calvary Student Chapel. Pastor Strawn and I will be co-officiating. He's going to do the lion's share of the work, but I'm along for the ride for significant parts of it, and it's going to be at 7 p.m. Saturday night, 7 p.m. at Calvary. Weather permitting, we want to gather outside and then bring everyone in, and that is also what's going to be true at the sunrise service here. At 6:30, we're going to, weather permitting, gather outside and process into Jesus Christ is risen today when we get to that. And I'm really looking forward to it. This is, ironically, I'm here almost 2 years now as your pastor. It'll be 2 years and 2 weeks. And yet I was in the hospital, as you recall, last year. So this is my first Holy Week and Easter with you. And I am feeling a lot better than I was then, but I am pacing myself. I'm not getting any younger, I'm finding out. So I've got to do that in order to just kind of keep moving right along. Well, speaking of moving right along, we are moving right along. Hopefully this will be, I did a decent job focusing everything. Hopefully we will get through this pretty quickly. I wanted to move on with our series, The Church's One Foundation, which I started last week. We're talking a little bit about the two constituent parts of the church. which through which Christ acts in both realms. One was the royal priesthood of all believers, and the other is the office of the holy ministry. What I want to do this week and next week is break both of those down into more specifics. So today we're just going to focus on the royal priesthood. The church is the gathering of believers is referred to in 1 Peter 2 as a royal priesthood. Inside that language is the weight of a lot of Old Testament teaching about priests and what priests did. The tribe of Levi, of the 12 tribes of Israel, was dedicated to the priesthood. Aaron himself was not of the tribe of Levi, I don't believe. And he fulfilled something of a priesthood role in Israel as well. And what the priests largely did was they largely probably did some proclaiming, but the biggest part of what they did was sacrifice. And as you know, that whole system in the Old Testament, that's a bloody old system. Lots of animals got sacrificed over centuries. You've probably heard me joke. I'm glad that I'm a post-Jesus New Testament Lutheran pastor, because I don't think I'd have the stomach for the Old Testament priesthood, to be quite honest with you. And Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, does us a favor and points out how Jesus' once for all sacrifice ends that system. And in ending that system, we, the royal priesthood, have a new way of looking at sacrifice, and sacrifice is what we do. But I don't think any of you have ever sacrificed an animal, and if you did, you might want to come talk to me, because you probably didn't have to. But anyway, let's talk about the task. Let's take a look at the royal priesthood up close and talk about the task of the royal priesthood in the church before next week we talk a little bit more about the task of pastors in the church. When we talk about sacrifice now, post Jesus's once for all sacrifice, the chief sacrifice of the Christian life is the sacrifice of prayer. You've heard me say that the central activity of the Christian life is repentance, and that's true. Repentance should lead us into prayer. It should lead us, first of all, into a prayer of confession of sins over the sins that we've committed. But we do now have an advocate before the Father. His name is Jesus, who is ascended on high and sits at God's right hand, to whom we may pray. And therefore, aside from repentance, the singular privilege of the Christian life is that we can pray straight to God. There's a lot of talk about how the Roman Catholic Church kind of lost that. They encourage, preaching to saints, or praying to saints, praying to Mary, all these sorts of things. The beauty of the scriptural New Testament teaching on prayer is that we do not need intercessors. The only intercessor we need is the one we can go straight to, and that's Jesus, and he will intercede on our behalf with the Father. So best to pray to him. Pray straight to God. You have that privilege. God has extended that privilege to you. You do not need to put other intermediaries in there. You have a straight connection in your prayers. And so the priesthood, the royal priesthood of all believers, is marked by prayer. It's an important part of who we are and what we do. It should be a daily activity, but we should pray daily and much. And indeed, you had Paul say, I think this is 2 Corinthians. I could be wrong in this. Sometimes when I have to think of a Bible verse on the fly, it doesn't come so fast. But he says, pray without ceasing, which is a remembrance, too, that all of our lives as Christians could be viewed as a prayer to God. Which leads us to the next thing. What is the priesthood there to do? Well, in this post-Jesus sacrifice New Testament church, good works, the Christian life. Good works are works that are done according to the Ten Commandments and to the glory of God only. They're carried out in vocation. Sometimes we in the church kind of give the wrong impression that, your service here at Mount Olive is your best avenue for good works. Truthfully, it serves as a place where you can do your good works, and we do really appreciate that, but good works are part of all of life. God calls us into vocations, our various vocations in life: husband, wife, father, mother, child, worker, boss, citizen, and hearer of the word. Luther throws that in there as a vocation. In the church, pastor is part of that as well. He calls us into all those vocations to give us avenues to do our good works. Luther extols the father who changes his baby's diaper and says, it may not be a pleasant task, but it is still a good work. It's a good and holy work. It's fun to listen to Luther talk about vocation. It's a huge part of his theology. The Christian life is lived out in vocation so that you have arenas to know how to do good works. The other mistake we often make with good works is we sometimes talk about them as these sort of Superman-like works, that a good work isn't a good work unless you're lifting a bus off someone or something like that. And that's not true either. Good works, like the father changing the child's diaper, can be very, very mundane and very, very not noticeable. In fact, over the years, I've come to see that the way Luther talks about good works is almost identical to the way the Bible talks about sin in general. We commit so many sins every day that we don't even realize it sometimes when we do it. Good works works pretty similarly. As in living out our lives and our vocations, we commit so many good works in a day that we often don't realize how many we've committed either. And that's another thing. So as a royal priesthood, we pray, we live out our lives in vocation for the doing of good works. And lastly, we really do manage and steward all of life's resources for our benefit and for the benefit of the spread of the gospel. This is commonly called stewardship. Stewardship is often heard as a financial term, which is unfortunate because finances is really only one part of the whole situation. We give of our lives the same way Jesus gave of his life. Jesus is the chief steward, and it's not, and you don't hear any stories about Jesus giving any money. You hear stories about him collecting money, which was intended to be given to the poor, to be sure. That you do hear, but you don't ever see him give money anywhere in the texts. That doesn't mean you shouldn't. The church certainly needs us to do that, and they were taking care of people with the monies they were collecting, and that's the idea here. Your finances are just part of your stewardship, though. Your talents, your skills, your ability, the time that God gives you in this life to donate for the sake of the church, but just in all of life, again, good works aren't just restricted to what you do here in church. That's all part of that glorious stewardship. Many years ago, a pastor, I kind of find this a little crass, but it is simple enough to understand it. Describe the Christian life as three things: pay, pray, and obey. And that kind of summarizes these three that I'm talking about. But I tended to put nicer words to it. We talked about prayer, praying, the word pay, I would say give. That's the better word, giving. And obeying, obedience, well, that is tied to the good works and vocation. All of that is done according to the Ten Commandments, is how we obey our God after we've been saved, as we do these good works. And the world would be a much worse place without the royal priesthood. So we as a church really owe it to you to give you the best opportunities to do all of these things here in church, in our services, with the prayers in our services, with opportunities to serve and do good works, and also with our stewardship of the resources that you donate to us. I'm reminded, I think it was Maggie Thatcher who made the comment many years ago that socialism is a great system of government until you run out of other people's money. Believe it or not, I kind of have a similar attitude toward how we ought to manage the funds that are donated to us. It's important to understand, first of all, that whatever you give to us is dedicated to Christ. So once it's given, like in the offerings, we should start by all of us by recognizing that whatever it is you've given, money, food, time, talents, whatever, belong to Christ. That's where that begins. But I think it helps us in the leadership end of the church to remember too that that money came. Remember who the money came from or who the gifts came from, and learn to steward that with respect for those who gave it as well. That's very, very important. So we, as the leaders of the church, now I'm not just talking pastor here, but the people you elect when we have elections, we have a responsibility to think about you in all of our business and our doings, and involve you and try to glorify God through all of your wonderful and marvelous efforts, which we greatly do appreciate. So I want to say one last word about the royal priesthood. You heard me say the world would be a mess without the church. The world would be a mess without the royal priesthood of all believers. The church itself would be a mess without a kingdom of priests who do those things, who pray, who do their good works, and who give of all of life's resources for the sake of the spread of the gospel. If you do not hear it enough, let me thank God for all of you and all that you bring to the table here at Mount Olive. That is such a very important thing for me to say. Notice I thank God first, but I'm certainly grateful to all of you as well. I've gotten to know a marvelous congregation these last 2 years, and I can't wait to get to Holy Week. Well, we are in Holy Week, but to get to the services and actually do what I should have done last year. And we'll look forward to continuing to do, hopefully, in the future as well. So thank you. Thank you for your time, even in watching this podcast. And God's blessings to you this Holy Week. I hope it is a blessing to you. And I hope I see you Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at the services. And if I do not, or you're traveling, I really hope you have a blessed Easter, blessed remainder of your Holy Week, and blessed Easter. And God grant us all joy as we await our resurrections in Christ's resurrection. Have a great week.